Saeed, it's an honor to have you here with us, Professor. Professor Khalid Saeed is Professor of Economics and System Dynamics at the WPI, Forrester Polytechnic Institute in the US. He was awarded with J. Forbes Prize. He was a former president of System Dynamics Society, and we will talk about economic development, reach destruction, and human dynamics, proposal for rethinking developmental agendas. Professor Saeed, it's an honor to have you here. Please, the word is with you.
Hi, thank you very much. First of all, it's a pleasure to be talking to our colleagues out there in Brazil. And I'm going to talk about an idea which emerged from casual conversations with Forrester. And I should probably say that when we were graduate students, there was no such thing as casual conversations with Forrester. Everything had to be very formal and very well organized. We had to make an appointment with his very stern secretary, even to see him. But after I graduated, things changed, and I came back to Cambridge. I moved to Thailand after graduation, and I came back to Cambridge once, and that stern secretary, Nan Lux, was very pleasant, and she offered Jay's office to me, told me that I can use Jay's office and sit in his chair. And I thought things were very different. And then Jay and I later also had some casual conversations, and my sense was that he has a very different view of developing countries compared to what I've seen in the literature. In fact, he saw the developing country to be spent systems, which have sort of lost all their energy. And that was very interesting to me. That was very different to me. And during our conversations, he often referred to urban dynamics. And that's when I carefully looked at urban dynamics, and I have had some familiarity with Joseph Schumpeter, and I tried to look at it more carefully. And that's when this idea started emerging. And I have shared this with Forrester. In fact, I sent him a write-up and said, hey, can you just scan through it when you have time? And I got back an email from him same evening, said that I not only scanned through it, I've read through all of it, and I like it. So with this background, let me proceed. Okay, it works. Here is the overview of what I would like to present. I'd like to say a few words. What are the contemporary approaches to economic development, and what are the economic growth models? And I'd like to discuss Schumpeter, whom I see as a forerunner of urban dynamics. I actually developed a little model of what his concept of creative destruction is, and I'd like to talk about that model. Then I'd like to talk about urban dynamics and its relevance to economic development. There's some stuff grayed out in my slide. That is the political economy of exclusion, poor governance, low welfare, and insurgents, which is a concern, and I have addressed these things elsewhere, but I don't think we'll have time to talk about these today. And I also have a framework for a more complex economic development model. I again think that we should do that maybe at another time. And I'd like to share my conclusions. Now, first, the contemporary approaches to economic development. As you might all be familiar, the predominant view is that there's a gap between developing countries and developed countries. Labor is unlimited in the developing countries and there are no resources or environmental constraints to growth. Now we do these issues lip service now, but I guess in our models and in our planning, that is still the implicit assumption. Professor Lewis talked about structural transformation, and that also is aimed at creating economic growth at a faster rate because he felt that there is a certain structure of obsolescence which exists in the developing countries that impedes economic development, and the structural transformation can speed up the process. So we should talk a little bit about that concept. We should at least know that concept. And then there are people who are humanists and sort of social scientists. Economic development has become a multidisciplinary area, and there are propositions about human and social development can occur, and that's again part of the contemporary approaches. And then there are libertarians like Amartya Sen, who talk about freedoms and equality to remove the exclusionary barriers, and again that is a peripheral add-on issue in the economic development literature. Now, formal models are used. Formal models are divided into three. I have here three categories. One is the classical models, and these are absolutely magnificent, as Baumol pointed out. These are detailed description of how systems work, starting with Adam Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, Marx, and finally Schumpeter. Again, just to understand these classical thinkers, I've tried to construct models of their thinking, which we'll not have time to share today, but I'll talk about the last one, which is Schumpeter. Then there's a big jump from there. In fact, those models are usually brought up in the context of economic history, not in the context of macroeconomics or economic development. The contemporary models for developing countries are by Harry-Domer, Solow, Romer, and Lewis, and I'm sure you're all familiar with these. Harry-Domer, in fact, focuses on savings and how those can be invested and can create growth. Solow brought in population growth and technological development, and in fact, in some ways, undermined the importance of savings in his model. And Romer suggests that while you cannot have improvement in productivity, you cannot have technological development just like that. There's a cost to it. So his model has to allocate resources between production and economic and technological development. And of course, there is Professor Lewis, who presented this analogy, which is well known, analogy of an elevator. And the developed countries are on the upper steps of that elevator, and developing countries are at the lower steps. And when the whole system moves, the gap remains, and he felt that the structural transformation can narrow that gap. And then there are incremental policy agendas that try to address human and social development and the libertarian ideas like freedoms and stuff. There are contemporary models for developed countries, which are macroeconomic models. You see them in macroeconomic texts. There are separate texts for economic development and macroeconomics. And the macroeconomic models are by Keynes, Samuelson, Messler. There's aggregate supply, aggregate demand. And the policies are macroeconomic interventions to control growth and recover from recession. And incidentally, growth and recession seem to be viewed as separate events, not part of a continuum. they were seen as part of a continuum, then we would be cognizant about longer-term cycles that Forrester has pointed out to in his unpublished work. That's our national model. Again, that's something that I'll not discuss today. You would notice that the macroeconomic and economic development models are separate, and that means that there's a notion that one group is relevant to industrialized economies and the other to the developing countries. In fact, if you see as the two experiences as manifestations of the same human organization, then packaging these models in separate compartments does not seem the right thing to do. In fact, there is an interesting episode here, and I'd like to relate it. Back in 1983, I was a visiting professor at Dartmouth College, and working with Barry and with Dennis and Dana, and there were some visiting scholars out there too. And a new article from Professor Lewis came out in the American Economic Review that emphasized that, in fact, developing and developed countries are sort of different systems and should be addressed by different models. I've forgotten the name of the article. I can dig it out afterwards. And I felt a strong opposition to that idea, and I wrote a detailed letter to Professor Lewis saying that, in fact, they should be seen as part of the same system, different manifestations. Only then we can point to policies which allow us to change from one outcome to the other outcome. And my colleagues at Dartmouth joked with me and said, hey, Khalid, when you write to a Nobel laureate, you get a reply, but it's a one-liner. And so I forgot all about it, and several weeks later, a letter came in the mail, and it said from Professor Arthur Lewis. And my colleagues actually saw that letter and personally brought it to me, and we opened it in a group. And in fact, it was a one-liner. I got a reply, and the one-liner said, "Dear Professor Saeed, I have retired and I don't respond to in detail to questions like this." That was just a digression. What I want to say is that, in fact, there is no reason for packaging the analytical frameworks in separate texts and separate packages for developed and developing countries, and probably that is a problem that needs to be addressed. Now, making a big jump here, coming to Schumpeter's contribution, which really was made back in the 1930s and 40s, which was a time of economic recession and war in the United States. And in fact, back at that time, one big concern was that the membership of the Communist Party of the United States was growing. It grew to a number like 75,000 or something. And there were strong reactions and concerns to this phenomena. And you might have also heard the McCarthyism phenomena, which emerged at that time, which sort of categorically dismissed all such leftist movements. And Marxism was a dirty word. And so in those circumstances, I just want to relate the circumstances. Schumpeter's theory of creative destruction emerged. And interestingly, it pointed a way out of a melee that existed at that time, a serious depression. It pointed a way out of it. It showed that there is light at the end of the tunnel. And in fact, his forecast, his prophecy was realized. The economy did re-emerge, and in fact that was a very important model that he suggested, yet it does not exist in the macroeconomic text and also not in the economic development text. I mean, it's just mentioned the passing, and then we deal with the contemporary models. I also want to point out that Schumpeter's model is descriptive. It's like part of positive economics. It doesn't prescribe anything. It just explains why the recession occurs and how it shows a way to an upturn. Now, nothing works better than a stock and flow diagram as far as explaining the concepts is concerned. This is my stock and flow diagram of Schumpeter's view of the economy. Now, the upper system here consists of three stocks. This is labor, employed, and entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are capitalists of sorts. Now, at that time, I want to point out that Marxist views were that these entrepreneurs are a separate capitalist class. And Schumpeter's concept was that there are these three types of people or workers. There are these entrepreneur capitalists, there are unemployed people, and there is labor. And in fact, mobility exists between all these stocks. So unemployed people can become entrepreneurs, and unemployed people are hired and they become labor. And some of the people who are employed can also become entrepreneurs. So entrepreneurs were like new capitalists who at the time of recession develop new technologies, mobilize resources, and create what he called autonomous investment. In fact, he divided investment into two parts. There's autonomous investment, which is brought about by the entrepreneurs, and there is induced investment, which occurs as a matter of course. So induced investment is response to a discrepancy in the existing system. And the entrepreneurial investment, which is autonomous investment, is something new. It brings in a new technology, a new product, a new type of service. And he felt that it's that autonomous investment which pulls the system out of recession. So one important aspect is what he called climate, entrepreneurial climate, which is modeled here as climate factor. And the climate depends on two things. When the wage rate is low, the climate factor is good. It's a good entrepreneurial climate. And second is the rate of return. When the rate of return is high, that's good entrepreneurial climate too. So when entrepreneurial climate is good, the mobility for entrepreneurs is high, so more of them will join this pool here, this stock. And when the climate factor is poor, in fact, then the mobility suffers also. So this is basically the model. There is an aging chain of the capital. There is the entrepreneurial new capital, and after a while it's become sort of traditional, and then there is a discard, and then there is a chain sort of of the workers in which people can move between categories. And he felt that when there are more people here in this category, that is a good sign, and that happens when in fact there are more unemployed people, and there is a good potential rate of return. Also, he felt that when there is a lot of traditional capital here, sort of obsolete technology capital, in the US context, we call it General Motors and Chrysler, which got bailout, by the way. He felt that that's the distribution that is not conducive to recovery and growth. So I want to point out one thing. While the performance indicators in the economic development literature look mainly at the GDP growth rates and peripherally at levels of poverty, human services and stuff. Here Schumpeter is looking at the composition of capital and the composition of labor force, not at the magnitude and growth rate per se, but their composition, which is a very interesting point to keep in mind. And when you simulate this model, and I started with a hypothetical equilibrium here, and I disturbed the equilibrium by increasing the productivity of technological growth. So entrepreneurs' productivity is exogenously enhanced. We test system dynamics models through these external functions, and the idea is to bring out the internal dynamics. And so here are the internal dynamics which are generated, which show cycles of what Schumpeter called creative destruction, basically saying that the number 2 is traditional capital. When that is growing, in fact, the number of entrepreneurs is declining, and the climate factor is number 3. So when the traditional capital rises, more people are employed, and in fact there is a high wage rate because labor market is tight, and also there is some crowding in the capital investment, so rate of return declines. So in fact entrepreneurial environment is poor over periods of growth of the traditional capital. And when there is an over investment there and the rate of return has declined, at that time, in fact, there's a turning point, and at that turning point, people are laid off, and when they are laid off, the wage rate improves, and also the capital is retired, and in fact the rate of return improves, and that improves the climate factor, and we have another cycle. Now in the system these cycles damp out, but in reality when there's a noise in the system, in fact every cycle there's a new boost, and you would see continuous cycles. So basically he devised a term which is called creative destruction, that while the creation, which is the entrepreneurial investment, autonomous investment, leads to an environment in which destruction occurs, and that sets the conditions for another cycle of growth. There was one surprise though. When I simulated this model, I looked at the end distribution here. When he explained the cycles well, he probably didn't look at the end distribution. And what I found in the end distribution, that you notice number 1 is the number of entrepreneurs. That's lower than the beginning level here. And the traditional capital, which is number 2, that's higher than the beginning level. And in fact the climate factor is also poor. So in fact we are going towards a homeostasis in which the composition of the system is not very healthy. And if you look at the properties of this composition, this is like developing countries, that while there are not many entrepreneurs, there are sort of obsolete industry, obsolete sort of traditional capital that's there. And so that's an environment which is not conducive to growth even. Now in this system, since I was familiar with Forrester's urban dynamics, I tried to implement that same policy. That is, what if we speeded up the retirement rate of traditional capital. And this can be done through fiscal incentives quite easily, through taxation structure, through incentives given to people who want to create new types of investment. So creating a competitive edge for the entrepreneurs and creating a disadvantage for the traditional capitalists. And so this is the point, actually this is sort of end point of the previous simulation. And this is the point where the policy of decaying the traditional capital more rapidly is implemented. And you see there is a change in composition. In this change, we end up with a better climate factor. We end up with more entrepreneurs, and we end up with less traditional capital. By the way, here is the complete simulation, the first part and the second part. Now, stepping back, in fact, I begin to think that creative destruction might be more than an explanatory process. Maybe it's an economic development principle. When developing countries are viewed as infant, nascent economies, there's a gap between them and the mature economies. The growth is the sensible policy. But when you see that an economy has come to a homeostasis under resource institutional constraints, some infrastructure must be removed to make room for any new activity. And the infrastructure may not be limited just to physical infrastructure. It might also include institutions. There might be outdated norms, outdated rules of society, or outdated laws. So I would extend the definition of infrastructure to subsume some of those factors too. Now, when we do view developing countries as old, ailing economies, creative destruction appears as an important policy paradigm which should be part of any policy package. So I'm using these two analogies, an infant and old ailing. In the medical profession, for children, we go to a pediatric specialist, pediatrist, and for older people, you go to an old age specialist, like what do we call it, geriatric specialist or something. And here I was thinking that if the developing countries are old ailing economies, they probably cannot respond well to pediatric medicine. So here's a point to think a bit. Now, coming to Forrester's model, in fact, Forrester's model adopts creative destruction as an intervention process. And that's one thing which was interesting to me. Another thing that was interesting was that it is an economic growth process with a very physical operational meaning. That means the policy agenda that it can issue can relate to something which is on ground and would not be very difficult to implement. So here is the proposal that this old concept of developing economies as infant nascent systems on their way to maturity needs to be discarded and replaced by the concept that there are aging systems in a low welfare homeostasis, which is reached under resource institutional constraints. And I think that's the big step. That's a disruptive proposal, and that may not be very easy to accept and move on with. Now, after this proposal, let me give you a view of Forrester's urban dynamics model. I hope people have read it, and I would like to urge you to take a look at it, because I think it's one of the best models that Forrester developed. You take a look at the the worker chain here. He has 3 stocks. These are managerial professionals, there are workers, and there are underemployed. And they correspond exactly to the stocks in Schumpeter's model, in which managerial professionals are entrepreneurs, workers are labor, and the underemployed are the unemployed people. And if we look at the businesses, again, I showed 2 stocks. I could have shown 3 because I was trying to model Schumpeter, but I want to create an economical model. So he has new enterprises, mature businesses, and declining industry, which also corresponds to Schumpeter's view of new autonomous investment infrastructure and the old induced investment infrastructure, although these 2 are aggregated into the same stock in my model. And then he has a housing stock. To me, that housing infrastructure is like induced investment. Housing is the infrastructure which is constructed when a need arises. So when a discrepancy exists, you would build housing. So he separates this out, this induced investment out, and induces this this housing aging chain to represent it. What I found different was that Forrester's urban dynamics is a totally open economy. So in that simple model of Schumpeter, the workers are in the system, and they are a constraint to growth in some ways. In urban dynamics, they can come and go. And in fact, modern economies are open economies. Same thing with business investment. The business capital can come from outside, and which is also true. In fact, in modern economies, the capital is pretty footloose too. A lot of developing countries where the investment environment is not good, people are investing outside the country, in other countries, in other economies. So in some ways, that's also very appropriate. And his constraint to growth is land, and I think there can be some sort of resource constraints. There can be water, there can be land, there can be some other external fixed things that create some sort of a leveling off towards the end. And the housing, in fact, to me, again, that's symbolic, and it represents an induced investment part. Forrester's model also, after growth is initiated, matures into a distribution. You notice the distribution here. Declining industry is low, and in fact, the mature businesses and new enterprises are high. If you look at the composition at this point, and if you look at the composition here, you see that declining industry is high, mature businesses are high, and new enterprises low. So in fact, the composition over the growth period is very different from composition towards the end. And Forrester, this is the policy that he suggests, and the policy he he suggests that if you speed up the retirement rate of old infrastructure, and this can be again be done through fiscal means. He doesn't mean that you send out bulldozer to demolish the old infrastructure. Although a lot of the criticisms of Forrester literally sort of felt that that's what he means, and they criticized him for it. but he does mention in the book that this policy can be implemented through fiscal means. You notice the change in composition here. The number of entrepreneurs, in fact, rises, and the declining industry ends up at a lower level, and we have mature businesses which sort of end up at a higher level. So, in fact, the composition here after his policies is better than the composition here. This is changes in the workforce composition, and again we notice that over the course of growth we have more managers, professionals, and towards the end equilibrium we have a lower. And if you look at these proportions here and look at these proportions, you have much lower proportion of manager professionals. And again, if you use this policy of a proactive creative destruction, you end up with a much better composition in which there are more entrepreneurs. He doesn't look at even the GDP per capita or growth rates. He just looks at composition and infers from the compositions that if you have better composition, you have a healthier economy. So Forrester is basically saying that US cities are aging economies in a homeostasis brought about by physical constraints and openness. The homeostasis is characterized by an infrastructure and workforce composition that is dominated by slum housing, failing businesses, underemployed people. Growth, job creation policies are not relevant for such economies, and there's a need to take out the obsolete infrastructure to make room for new enterprises. So he suggests an active policy of destroying old infrastructure, which will change the nature of the homeostasis. Applied to the developing countries, seems to explain how low welfare homeostasis is ailing old economies and how it's reached under physical and resource constraints. Advocates removal of old infrastructure to make room for entrepreneurial activity that changes composition of workforce and industry when mobility between working classes exists. It does not address the institutional processes which I grayed out in the beginning, which are exclusionary, like there's a class structure which excludes people from participating in certain activities, and that impedes mobility. So the concept of resource constraint can be extended, in fact, I feel, to include the institutional constraints. The institutional constraints, let me mention those in the passing. The exclusionary processes include income distribution mechanisms, infrastructure bias, and social services bias, again, that seem to serve certain categories of industry and certain types of people more than the other people. And then there are civil rights and freedom issues, again, which impedes the mobility of some classes into entrepreneurial activity. And then there is, now we have seen this phenomena of insurgents and defense, and in fact both insurgents and the defense mechanisms extract rent from the working people. One type of rent fuels insurgent, the other type of rent fuels defense. These issues are addressed elsewhere. I have a book, Development Planning and Policy Design, which probably is out of print now, but these are addressed there. There's a more recent summary of what's discussed in the book, and that's in this paper, Possibilities for Poverty Alleviation, which recently appeared in this volume by Myers. And as far as the freedom and civil rights are concerned, some aspects of it are discussed in development planning and policy design. And the others are in a recent article which appeared in System Dynamics Review titled Farmers, Bandits and Soldiers. So let me conclude. The developing country economies are in fact similar to industrialized country economies because both at times come to stagnation and recede, and they should be seen as manifestations of the same system. And it's that low welfare homeostasis, that composition, which is important to address, in fact, if we want to deal with this stagnation effectively. Let me stop here. Are there any questions? Hello?
Thank you for your presentation. Let me see if we have some questions.
Hello, Professor Saeed. This is Aldo Zagonel. Thank you very much. This is very interesting, both the economic and the urban aspects. My question is, well, first let me say that when I hear what you're saying, I can't help but think about the debate that there is in the United States right now about the renewal of the aging infrastructure and how reluctant, how difficult it seems to be to make investments in the aging infrastructure. And your work makes it seem so clear that that is so important, which brings me to two questions. One is, does your work, has your work made its way to policymakers so that they can use it in the argument in favor of renewing the infrastructures? And two is, have you thought about including in your considerations this resistance to creative destruction that appears to exist? Thank you.
Thank you. Those are excellent questions. And the brief answer to those questions is no and no. This represents very recent thinking, and as I mentioned, I think it calls for a disruptive change in the thinking process. And you might have noticed that there was a bailout in the United States when the large industrial companies were failing. In fact, automobile industry was the first to be established in the United States, so it was established by pioneers and entrepreneurs. It was something very new. And now when it's failing, it should probably be replaced by something which is more current. And you might notice that while Honda has announced that it would have a fuel cell vehicle available in a year or two, and we have a small effort here in terms of what's the name of that electric car? Tesla in the United States. And while the large companies which received huge bailouts are continuing to turn out sort of substandard quality vehicles. Now, if General Motors and Chrysler had been allowed to fail, don't you think there might be more Teslas and more sort of new technology industries? Entrepreneur does exist in this country, and yet the government policy did not recognize it. I think it will come. I think Schumpeter's concept is true, and it happens. The cycle has a very long periodicity. So the replacement process, the replacement of obsolete infrastructure, in some ways has been deferred by the intervention. Now, your second question, whether I should include the resistance in the model. Many years ago, I wrote an article that was titled Slicing a Complex Problem. So, in fact, if we partition a complex problem into little slices and then try to understand these slices, perhaps that might be more illuminating than putting everything together. If I developed a very complex model which had everything in it, it will be very hard to understand that model and to really articulate its findings and the learning from it. So I think your second question relates to a very fine methodological issue, and my response is that I hesitate to do that. In fact, I'd like to use models as thinking instruments, and you can really use various slices of a complex problem to facilitate that thinking.
Any more questions from the audience? No more questions.
Good evening, Professor. Thank you very much. My name is Daniela. I'd like to ask you if is your model applicable to also to underdeveloped countries before they achieve the lower homeostasis, so they why they didn't have reached near 100% of land using differently well-developed country that reaches almost 100%. So there is room for this renewal.
Let me try to understand that your question. You are asking that is this concept applicable to all the developing countries, or are there cases in which there is still room for growth? Is that a correct interpretation?
Yes, if you could use this model to prevent lower homeostasis in underdeveloped countries, even if they don't have this very old housing to renew before they have a bigger stock, a large stock of old housing.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Actually, housing to me is just a symbolic sort of infrastructure. It's an analogy. But I think your question is very well taken, that there's a large variety of countries. There are ones which might have a huge stock of unused resources, and Brazil would be one of them. And there are others like India or China in which there are really not many resources, and the environmental constraints also seem to be becoming binding. My response would be that growth is an aspect which should be treated separately from composition. At every stage, whether there is room for growth or not, a good composition of the economy will create a good environment for the people. If there is room for entrepreneurship, you would have more people from the workforce joining the entrepreneurial pool. That would actually help income distribution too. So if we do not sort of have the resource constraint, there will be some other issues, some other endogenous constraints which might arise at every stage. But I think the main message is that the composition of the economy is a very important performance indicator which has not been considered at all in my view in economic development. The economic development is centered on growth. Then, of course, there is attention to poverty alleviation. There is attention to health, sanitation, etc. So what I'm saying is, whether there is room for growth or not, the composition of the economy is an important thing to consider. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you, Professor. Professor, thank you very much for your presentation. You were very kind to be ready to do this presentation for us.
Thank you.